Hello, this is Sonny with the Frogman Aneurysm Podcast number 2. A real story from the other side of survival, and lots of other things also. Last time I told you how I went from sitting in a restaurant to waking up in the ICU after major surgery. 7 days in intensive care followed. I did not know if I was going to make it through, but at least I was alive now. This is part of the story that is about the ICU days and also about what happened after I got out. Because leaving the ICU doesn't mean you're back to normal. No way. In some ways, that's where a very different kind of challenge begins. This is the part nobody can really prepare you for, what recovery actually feels like when you get home, try to live your life, and realize something just is not right. In the ICU, well, I went from barely ever taking a prescription in my life. I had antibiotics every now and then, to suddenly being in the ICU, taking a handful of pills every day, at least twice a day, sometimes more, and nothing about it felt normal. I was on all kinds of prescriptions, something I've never experienced before. There was one potassium pill. It was huge. The nurses, they'd ask me if I wanted cut in half. Well, after a while, I just got used to it. Even that became normal. They were constantly checking my blood. I had 2 access points in my arms the whole time, one on each side. One in the left arm, one in the right arm. It felt like they were always drawing blood, always adjusting something, trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. Like they were learning my body in real time. Sleep, well, that didn't really exist, not in a real way. They had a blood pressure cuff on my arm set to go off every hour at first. Just when you start to drift off, it tightens, and it wakes you right back up. Later, they changed it to every 2 hours, and eventually before I left, they finally took it off. That's when I realized it was a real pain, and how constant it had been. And it wasn't just that. There were machines beeping all the time, not just in my room, but up and down the hallway. And the bed wasn't great either, but it wasn't supposed to be the Ritz. It was a place to recover, not to get comfortable. They didn't really want to give me anything for sleep, but after pushing the issue a bit, they finally decided to give me a low-dose muscle relaxer, something to calm things down. And it worked somewhat. I was able to sleep sometimes maybe 2 hours in a row. And that's when I realized as a patient, well, you got to tell them if you don't like something, but don't complain too much. Eating again was its own process. Because the tubes that had been down my throat, I had to be tested before they would allow me to eat food. It wasn't automatic. I had to pass the test. And I did. Even then, though, things didn't taste right. Fruit didn't taste like fruit. Peaches certainly didn't taste like peaches. Applesauce didn't taste like applesauce. It took a few days before I found out what worked. Tuna, cereal, hard-boiled eggs, meatloaf, vegetables. They also had me getting up and moving, which was really good. Again, at first, walking with the IV pole, then eventually on my own, but always with someone there in the beginning, even to go to the bathroom. I had to call someone. Independence disappears fast, and you earn it back step by step. So, yeah, no real sleep, food that didn't taste right, machines beeping nonstop. And behind all that, there was a team that had just rebuilt part of my body and was trying to keep everything stable. It didn't feel comfortable, but I was alive, and that's what counts. In just a few days, my whole life had flipped from total independence to needing permission to eat, walk, and even go to the bathroom. But you come out of that with a different kind of respect for your body and for the people keeping you there. By the fourth or fifth day, something shifted. At first, I was just trying to survive. Time, time didn't make much sense. But then my head started to clear, and that's when the restlessness kicked in. I remember thinking, why am I still here? The machines were still beeping, people still coming in and out, but I wasn't in the same fog anymore. I was aware, maybe too aware, and I wanted to get out. Not because I was better, well, at least not fully, but because something in me said, you don't belong in this bed anymore. That was the first time I felt the pull to get back to life, even though my body was not ready for it. At one point in the ICU, someone came in and asked me if I wanted home care. You know, someone that would come to your home and help you do your daily chores and help my wife and help me recover. I thought about it, and not very well, I guess. I said no. I figured I'll be all right. I'll manage. I didn't think I needed it. Well, that was a mistake, because when I got home, reality set in pretty quick. I had a 12-inch incision down my chest, still healing, tube holes in my thigh. I couldn't lift more than 10 pounds. I had to be careful not to get the wound wet, and no scrubbing anywhere near it. It was hard just putting my clothes on. And the simple things, well, that's what I just said, they're not simple anymore. Brushing my teeth felt like a chore. Flossing, that was a whole operation. Taking a shower was tough. I couldn't reach, couldn't move the way I normally would. My wife had to wash my back for the first week until I finally figured out how to manage it myself. Going around the house, it wasn't terrible. I just had to slow everything down. But it hit me. This wasn't a quick bounce back. This was recovery. And my wife, well, God bless her, she stepped up in every way. Meals, driving me to every appointment. She carried most of the load while I was figuring out how to function again. Looking back, I should have said yes to that home care. After 7 days, I did get out of the ICU and I went home. Before I left, I agreed to have a visiting nurse come every few days. That was a good decision. They turned out to be very helpful. They checked my vitals. They gave me exercises to do. And I had this breathing device to help me build my lungs back up. At first, everything was slow, but after about 2 weeks, I started moving better. I even made it outside. That was great. Just walking in the driveway, seeing the sun, seeing the clouds. The nurses kept saying, keep moving. Well, I did. I always liked to keep moving. Early on, I always had someone with me, just in case I fell. My wife followed me upstairs and downstairs, but little by little I got stronger, and eventually I could walk back and forth on my own. I felt like I was heading in the right direction. Then, well, sleeping at night became a problem. I couldn't sleep. At first it reminded me of the hospital, restless and comfortable, but now it was quiet, way too quiet. And then it got worse. I started having what I can only describe as breathing panic attacks. Every time I laid flat, and even sometimes when I was standing, I felt like I was going to run out of air, like I couldn't breathe deep enough. This went on through Christmas, into the next 4 weeks, and I kept telling the doctors over and over how I felt, but at that point, there weren't any answers. Finally, it got bad enough, And my wife took me back to the emergency room. They ran every test you can think of. They even drained fluid from my lungs twice. Still no relief. And then they found it. My valve was damaged. It wasn't closing properly. Blood was washing back the wrong way. It should have been working at about 50 to 60%, which is kind of normal, and mine was at 35%, sometimes lower. I needed a new valve, and the first thought was they might have to open my chest again. Well, that was definitely not a good idea, and I didn't want to go through that again because my chest was pretty well healed by this time. It just didn't sound good to me, and it didn't sound good to the doctors either because there could be a lot of complications. But then they told me about another option, a procedure called a genivalve. And instead of opening the chest, where it had just been split, they could go through the groin and guide this valve up through a vein and place a new valve inside the old one. That's definitely a wow. The catch? Well, it was still an experimental stage in the United States. Luckily, my surgeon knew a doctor at another hospital who had done this procedure many times, and he agreed to take my case. Oh, that was great. Another lifesaver. So they transferred me by ambulance about 60 miles to another hospital. I remember telling the driver what was going on. He got me there fast. When I arrived, they first adjusted my medications after hearing about my panic attacks. Well, that adjustment, in that first night, I slept for the first time in weeks. I slept as long as they left me until there was, of course, more checks. No panic, no gasping, just sleep. It really felt like a turning point for me. I stayed there 6 more days in that hospital. Test after test after test. One of them, I could actually see the synthetic aorta that day had attached to my heart. That was wild. It was unbelievable. Finally, after everything, they did say I was a candidate for the procedure, the valve insertion. But there was one more step. It had to be approved by the Genivalve board. It also had to be approved by the hospital board. Because in the United States, this was not standard yet. And because I had an aortic aneurysm, it might not even be approved. So now I was waiting again. Only this time I knew what was exactly at stake. So I'm in the new hospital, 6 days of testing behind me, and a decision hanging over everything. They think they can do the procedure, but it's not routine because of, like I said, my aortic aneurysm. It just had to go in front of the Genivalve board for approval. The hospital said they would do it. So I'm sitting there waiting, knowing that this isn't just another step. Opening me up again could have serious implications, and as I said, I did not want to go through that again. So this is the next shot at fixing what went wrong or going back to square one. So they sent me home to wait. And at that point, I understood something real clear. Recovery wasn't a straight line. It could go Genivalve or it could go open me up again. In the next episode, I'll tell you what happened when that decision came back and what it was like going into a procedure that at that time wasn't widely done in the United States. Okay, This is Sonny with the Frogman Aneurysm Podcast number 2, a real story from the other side of survival, and so much more.